So yeah, thanks for joining us today. Brianna will be presenting our webinar. So I'll pass it over to her to introduce the topic and introduce herself. So thanks, Brianna.
Excellent. Thank you, Madison. Let me get the webinar up. So today we're going to be talking about publishing large data on ESS-DIVE's Tier 2 storage service. What large data means, what is Tier 2? We're going to be answering all of those questions today. So kind of the basic objectives of this webinar today is defining what ESS-DIVE considers large data, as well as an overview of the data submission tools that we have at our disposal at ESS-DIVE, and defining these kind of nebulous terms of Tier 2 and Globus, terms that we've been throwing around a lot behind the scenes at ESS-DIVE, and we want to make sure that you're all looped in. And finally, figuring out if your data is suitable for large data support. So this session really is focused for kind of designed for data managers and data contributors. So let's jump in. What is large data to ESS-DIVE? We define large data as any file or set of files whose total size is greater than 500 gigabytes. That's what we consider large data at ESS-DIVE. So these data packages cannot be uploaded via the UI, which has a 10 gigabyte upload limit. Can't be uploaded via the package service API, which has a 500 gigabyte upload limit. So these data sets require special handling. Common types of large data include genomics data, model data, remote sensing, and sensor network data. So these are just kind of some of the most common types of really large data that we see in our area. But there are plenty more outside of this scope that exist, but you might be part of one of those. So we're talking a lot about really large data, but this webinar isn't just for people with really large data. If you're under the 500 gigabyte kind of the maximum of the UI or the package service, if you're still experiencing bottlenecks, the large data tools can be beneficial to you and your team. So some of the reasons why you might be having difficulties uploading, even if it's not large, 499 gigabytes is still pretty massive. So some of the reasons you might be having difficulty uploading, available local memory is smaller than the data volume. If you have a Chromebook, you're not going to be able to handle a lot of data. So that might be something that you might be experiencing. If you have a lot of files that are large, but too large to upload piece by piece, and too large to upload all at once, too painful almost, basically, to upload piece by piece. Or maybe you're having unstable internet. I mean, I have Xfinity. A lot of us have different Wi-Fi or different internet connections, and these kinds of unstable internet connections can really cause a lot of issues when you're uploading data. You might get halfway through an upload and it fails. It's always heartbreaking. So these tools can still benefit you. So don't lose hope. Even if you're under 500 gigabytes, this webinar is still for you. So the tools that we're using. Today's webinar is going to focus on two of the new tools in the ESS-DIVE ecosystem, which is Globus, which is a data submission tool for moving or transferring large volumes of data, as well as ESS-DIVE's Tier 2, our secondary storage location for data publication and access. Both of these are services that are set up by the ESS-DIVE support team in conjunction with the data contributor. So hopefully many of you have kind of gone through our traditional publication process. This process will take a little bit more time since there's more back and forth rather than you alone uploading your data. It's a collaboration between your team and our team to get the data uploaded into whatever service and stored wherever it needs to be stored, so that we can handle these larger data volumes. So let's dive into looking at the submission tools. Many of you are going to be familiar with the data submission web form, which is through the user interface. Hopefully everyone's used that before. We also have our dataset API, which you can access programmatically and is often used to programmatically upload metadata and data to ESS-DIVE. And finally, we have what we're talking about today, the Globus data transfer service. So let's look a little bit more at each of these tools. First thing is file volume. I've mentioned this a few times and I'm going to keep mentioning it. The file volume, it basically represents how much data each tool can upload at once. So the data submission web form, as I mentioned, has a limit of 10 gigabytes. So with the web form, you could select one 10 gigabyte file or 10 1 gigabyte files, but it's only 10 gigabytes is the maximum. On the dataset API, if you're uploading programmatically, you can upload up to 500 gigabytes. If you have more than 500 gigabytes, obviously, these are not going to work for you. And that is where the Globus transfer service comes in. And that is for data over 500 gigabytes. We also have kind of limits for number of files. If you have less than 100 files in your data set, then the data submission web form can work, as well as the dataset API. And a lot of this comes from the difficulty of displaying really large volumes of data. ESS-DIVE, in ESS-DIVE user interface, the way we display data is non-hierarchical. So if you have over 100 data files, it's really, really hard to navigate as a data user. But if you do have a really large volume of files, the Globus data transfer service might be a good solution for your team because it is able to display hierarchical data. So hopefully it's not 100 or 200 flat files, but organized in some way, which the Globus data transfer service can support. So here are some kind of considerations. The data web form is, the upload process is all you. So you don't have to reach out to the ESS-DIVE team. There doesn't have to be any back and forth. And we have a lot of documentation. We've worked really hard on the user interface to make it as intuitive as possible. So hopefully that is a very easy process for a data contributor. The dataset API, again, it's all between you and your system for doing the upload. It does take a little bit more of an initial investment to get set up, but we do have a lot of documentation to allow you, if you're familiar, a little bit familiar with R or a little bit familiar with Python, we have documentation to get you up to speed so that you can feel comfortable and confident uploading via the dataset API package service. Finally is the Globus. One of the considerations is it is the longest process because, as I mentioned, there is that back and forth between the ESS-DIVE support team and your team. And it also requires the use of a separate desktop application. We'll be going into that a little bit later. But one thing that is a little bit easier with the Globus data transfer service is it is all user interface. So you're not going into the command line, you're not writing code. It is a lot easier to kind of navigate and move and use if you are not a programmer or don't have any programming experience. So Globus, we keep talking about it. We just want to highlight it in the table. The Globus data transfer service is a free nonprofit cloud-based data transfer service that is not associated with ESS-DIVE or LBNL. It is designed for researchers, specifically for research data and for moving around significant amounts of research data. ESS-DIVE uses this service to move data from your local desktop or maybe your project server into ESS-DIVE's extended resources. Basic reason we kind of like it, it's very well supported by NERSC, the supercomputing center at LBNL. So we have a lot of experts on site and we have a lot of support in our community for using Globus. And we also we've been getting more and more experience with this, and we have some really experienced team members. So for any users who are having trouble uploading data files of any size, and does not require that 500 gigabyte maximum. If you're having trouble with any size data file, reach out to the ESS-DIVE support team, and it might be that using Globus might be the best possible option for you and your team to transfer that data over to ESS-DIVE. So large data from a contributor's perspective. Often data is too big to download from their storage location onto a data manager's computer so that they can then upload it onto ESS-DIVE, or just, once maybe you have the data on your computer and the uploading process is just brutal. It's painful. You walk away and hope that it's working right, and you come back hoping it's uploaded, and actually it stopped 5 minutes after you walked away. I know we've all experienced similar things. And sometimes maybe you have your data on a cloud storage, and sometimes those providers' documentation of how to access data from an API or trying to get a tool that does the right thing just isn't accessible to you as a user, so that you feel like you're trapped on whatever cloud service you're using. ESS-DIVE will help you figure this out, and using Globus, we will get your data moved and where it needs to be on ESS-DIVE. And we've done this before. We're gonna have a user story here. We had a project whose data was in an online storage platform. It was too big to download by the project data manager, too cumbersome to upload to ESS-DIVE. And so in collaboration with the ESS-DIVE team, we were able to copy the data directly from the online storage into ESS-DIVE, clearing the bottleneck, cutting out the middleman, and getting the data where it needed to be. From a user perspective, it's some of the same issues. As while we might have trouble as data providers uploading a large amount of data, same goes for downloading. And if you're downloading large volumes of data, it can fail, and it can be really frustrating, and it can leave a data user really feeling just stuck and lost and frustrated, and maybe they might walk away from your data set. One of the other big issues is that there might be a mountain of files, but if the data set is over 3 gigabytes, the download all button on ESS-DIVE is disabled. So they would have to individually click through, taking this giant 65 gigabyte data tower apart brick by brick. And that can be an incredibly frustrating experience. So why we want to use Globus and why we like Globus. Globus uses a high performance data transfer protocol called grid FTP. And Globus also maximizes the bandwidth of your data transfer by tuning the parameters of that transfer, so that, if your internet slows down, Globus is constantly modifying the transfer process so that it can stay as efficient as possible. They also have automatic fault recovery if anything goes wrong. And they have what Globus calls fire and forget, which I've found incredibly helpful, where you are notified via email once your data transfer is complete, or if something goes wrong, you are notified via email that something went wrong. So I can walk away and I will be notified without having to sit there and watch the loading bar for however long. Globus also allows for generally just quicker and more reliable file transfers. And they also allow for bulk transfers for data users. So a data user can take a Globus collection that, like on ESS-DIVE, say, and transfer that into their own Globus space and have access to that data much more quickly and much more reliably than they might if they were, in the previous slide, taking the data down brick by brick. So we use Globus in 2 different main ways. One is to transfer data for upload to tier 1, which is kind of the underlying storage of our web UI. You can see here in this image, this is a real data set on ESS-DIVE that had a 254 gigabyte file. You know, it's under the 500. Oh, that makes it easy, right? Of course not. So their team was having trouble uploading this 254 gigabyte file, and we were able to work with their team, get it onto Globus and into ESS-DIVE so that data is now accessible. We also use Globus for transfer to tier 2, which is the ESS-DIVE large data storage, and I'll be getting to that shortly. So I have a little video here. Unfortunately today, of course, the ESS-DIVE endpoint at the Supercomputing Center NERSC is under maintenance. So we're gonna be watching videos instead of doing live demos. But this little video here is just, we're gonna start out with creating a Globus account. So to get an account set up, you'll use your ORCID, which if you're on ESS-DIVE, I know you have. So you'll sign in with your ORCID, fill out the information, and you'll give the Globus the permissions to access your data. And you will be presented with the Globus file manager. So the Globus file manager is kind of your center for where you're going to be doing a lot of your data transfers. So let's go to, now we have a file manager, we don't have any files in there. So we're going to go and talk about setting up the Globus desktop. So the Globus desktop application can be downloaded. To set up the Globus desktop application, you'll go to your file manager and you'll want to click collections. Collections is basically kind of your collection of data. So you'll open up your collections. Of course, you don't yet have anything in there. And you'll want to click on the Install Globus Connect Personal, as I do here. And you'll get, they saw that I was using a Mac, so they suggested the Mac. And now you'll see I've downloaded it. I'll go through the process. If you're on a Windows machine, you'll be working with the wizard. And once you get this all set up, now you have Globus Connect Personal on your local system. So we're now going to create a collection with Globus. So from your Globus Connect Personal, you'll allow Globus, apologies. You'll give Globus access to your local computer. So you'll put in the label, they will have, of course, you are connecting your whole computer to Globus. So once you get that set up, you will set up your collection. This is kind of the information, or this is basically what you're going to call it in the Globus file manager that we saw previously. You'll put in the information here. I do want to highlight this little checkbox here. If you do have any sensitive data, protected health information, controlled unclassified information on your computer, I recommend looking into the Globus high assurance setup. Just in case, I just wanted to draw attention to that. I do not, so I jumped right past that, and I set up my collection. So now that that collection has successfully been set up, we are going to go and explore what it looks like to actually share that data with ESS-DIVE. So once you have your collection set up, hopefully on your computer, you've kind of massaged the data, organized it, and designed it into the format that you want to upload to ESS-DIVE. And you've worked with the ESS-DIVE team and we've come to the agreement, yep, Globus is the way to go. You will send us your Globus account information. And once we have your Globus account information, we will set up our own collection in the ESS-DIVE ingest space to ingest your data. So once you get that, or once you've gotten your data ready and you've sent us your account information, we'll get that set up. And we will share with you an email that kind of looks like this. We'll have a direct link right there in the email, but you also can access your collection via the file manager. So from here, I went and I clicked up in this left search bar. You can do left or right, it's fine. So you'll open up the search bar and you'll click on the shared with you tab, and you can see the Globus demo or collection that ESS-DIVE created for me is there in the shared with you section. And you can see it's empty because we haven't put anything in there. So I'm going to open this up and I'm going to go to my collection, what I've called test collection. Right here, this is actually just everything on my computer. This is my whole computer. And so I'm going to go in and open up this practice directory. And you can see that I can kind of navigate through, check the contents, move up and down. One thing I will note though, Globus is not kind of the spot to rename files, reorganize things. Globus is just for transferring. So now that I've figured out what I want to transfer, I have done select all. I want everything in this directory. You don't have to select all, of course. You can just use the checkboxes here. But now that I've decided I want everything in the Globus practice directory, I'm going to start the transfer. Okay, yep, I'm going to put it into the Globus demo. That was very fast. And you can now see that all that data is in the Globus demo directory. So that's kind of the process for getting set up with Globus. Oops. That's kind of the process for getting set up with Globus and actually transferring the data over to ESS-DIVE. At this point here, you would send us an email saying, I did it. I uploaded my stuff to Globus. And from there, we would kind of go on to the next steps of actually getting it uploaded to data storage. So let's talk about storage. So tier 1 data storage. This is our basic, this is the classic ESS-DIVE storage. The tier 1 storage is the underlying storage behind the ESS-DIVE website. You've all probably interacted with it without knowing the name. So in tier 1, or data, when data is stored in tier 1, the data and metadata are accessible together, as many of you have seen, with the data files listed right there on the same page as all of your metadata, all your geolocation. And you also have access to a number of tools and features on the metadata landing page. What I want to highlight is kind of the downloads, the citations, and especially the file level download metrics. One thing on tier 1 is that the data is not really very browsable, and it's not, if you have if you really want to keep your hierarchy, that means that data has to be compressed into a zip file and can kind of make it harder for a data user to really see what's inside that data. A zip file is a giant mystery box. So on tier 2, which is our new storage, instead of storing data directly on those landing pages, very large hierarchical data is stored in tier 2, ESS-DIVE's extended file storage. So this is tier 2 is mainly used for archiving data greater than 500 gigabytes. And on the tier 2 website, you are able to browse folder hierarchies, look around, open up those directories that previously might have been zip files in tier 1. And data can be downloaded from the tier 2 landing page via a script or through Globus using Globus transfer, just like we saw in that video for upload, just the opposite direction. And the tier 2 data is made accessible via an external link on the metadata landing page. Some of you may have experienced or may have some experience with external links, and I'll be showing an example of what those external links look like shortly. Okay, so we're doing the file limit sizes again. Let's compare tier 1 and tier 2. So tier 1, maximum file size is 500 gigabytes. Tier 2, it can be any size, especially over 500 gigabytes. The file volume, again, tier 1, under 100 files. Tier 2 can be over 100 files. Data structure, as I mentioned in tier 1, is flat, whereas in tier 2, it can be hierarchical. Now, some of the areas that tier 2 does not excel as well as tier 1. In tier 1, the metadata is stored with the data. On tier 2, you would data that is stored on tier 2 always has an accompanying metadata on tier 1. So you'll still have a landing page in the traditional spot, but your data will be stored outside of that space. So your metadata is stored on tier 1, your data would be stored on tier 2. I think, to me, some of the benefits of having the data on tier 1 is that it's really accessible and easy for a user to kind of look at the data and look at the metadata together, providing really important context for a data provider. Download metrics. So, of course, download metrics really show that your data is useful and being used. And download metrics are available for data stored on tier 1, but currently it is not available for data stored on tier 2. And finally, new features and functionality. ESS-DIVE is constantly growing and expanding, and we have a lot of things in the works, and a lot of the energy is being put towards tier 1 storage and the tools and features available on the main ESS-DIVE website. While we are going to continue to support and grow and expand tier 2, it won't be at the same rate. And some of the tools that may exist on tier 1 may not really be integrated into tier 2, or at least there may be a long waiting period. So tier 1 is where you're going to get the cutting edge of ESS-DIVE. So let's really zone in on tier 2. We're going to do a little demo. Again, because of the system maintenance, we're going to be doing it through a video, but hopefully this kind of video of me playing around with tier 2 really captures what is possible. So we're going to start in tier 1, actually, ironically. We're going to start at the metadata landing page for this data set on ESS-DIVE. You can scroll down and you can see in the external links, we have the link to tier 2, which is what we're mainly talking about. We also have a link to Globus. And as you can see, there's no other data files in this data set. Everything is stored in tier 2 and Globus. So let's launch that tier 2 page. Here we have the tier 2 landing page. Up top, you can see this is our ESS-DIVE contents list, kind of showing what the data, or giving the citation, basic information, and also a breakdown of what the contents of this directory are. One thing that will happen with tier 2 is that your data will be uploaded, and then ESS-DIVE will add some kind of additional context at the top level. So your data is not going to be just directly ported from Globus into tier 2. Your data is not going to be ported directly from Globus into tier 2, but it's rather going to be massaged a little bit, organized, so that we can get important metadata and important information across to a user who's downloading or who's accessing this data. So let's take a look at that. As I mentioned here, that is the data directory that you uploaded to Globus. This metadata directory, though, this is set up by ESS-DIVE. And there you see I clicked on the metadata JSON file. Sorry about that. And as you can see from this metadata JSON, it looks like a JSON LD. It looks like a JSON format that many of you might be familiar with from using the package service API on ESS-DIVE. But this is not all the metadata from that data set. No. This is actually metadata just for the data. So as you can see, the title of this, the name here is data from, insert data, ESS-DIVE dataset title here. We have the URL that accesses this data, and we have the is part of. So that kind of links its relationship to the main ESS-DIVE landing page on tier 1 with all of the metadata that you've provided. So this one, or in tier 2, we really don't have the same levels of data specific metadata that is stored on tier 1 on your landing page. Oops, I apologize. Sorry about this. Okay, we're back to where we were. So now let's go look through some of the information that ESS-DIVE sets up. We have kind of the contents list. We also have checksums. So we're going to open a file that some people said was very scary looking. This is just a checksum of every single file uploaded to Globus in the data set. So these can be used for data users to validate that their downloads were correct and that they've successfully downloaded the files. And that is kind of just a way of tracking the data and keeping it clear and organized. But let's really dive into that data. We've looked at everything else. So let's look at the data that was provided to us. As you can see, it's a hierarchical data set. So we have directories and directories, and we can navigate through. So we'll go to this one. Let's look at image. Right here, you can see we can look at this image without actually having to download it. It's just, we're just browsing it, similar to an FTP server. We can look at JSON files. We can go and I clicked on this one. I edited out the part where it opened my download. So by clicking that, some types of files, it will open up, it'll launch a download. So it'll download to your system. I'm so sorry.
Oh, and then I think I'll just take this opportunity to say that we're getting some Q&A questions, and thank you so much for submitting those. And we'll address those at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Madison. So as you can see, you can navigate through, look at different files. One that I think is especially important is a PDF. So we can, without having to download anything, we can read this whole PDF, explaining the data, giving context, and learn more about kind of how the data was collected, all right here in the browser without having to download anything. So I'm definitely a committophobe, and sometimes committing to waiting however long the download may take can be pretty nerve-wracking. I'm never sure, oh, is this data what I really want? Do I really want to wait for an hour and a half and then find out it's not right? But when the data is here on tier 2, there is the ability to explore it a little bit more. So up here in the content list, we have the access via ESS-DIVE link, which I'm about to click. And this, it brings you back to your metadata landing page. Just like where we were at the start, we can go in a nice little circle here. And by clicking this link, it will bring us back to the metadata landing page on ESS-DIVE. So, and if we click on that again, we'll start an infinite loop. So here we are again, back at step 2 all over again. So that's a little exploration of tier 2. I think we had originally hoped that we would get to have a little bit of time to play around in Tier 2 live. But we hope that in your time, maybe tomorrow, if you have a moment, we would definitely encourage you to go and explore the Tier 2 data that exists on ESS-DIVE. So Tier 2, when do we want to actually use it? If your data is large enough to require Tier 2, we are very excited to support you. But we want to assure everyone that we are constantly growing out our Tier 1 services, and the constraints that make Tier 2 required may not always be our constraints. So Tier 1 is constantly growing, and we do want to encourage people, if they can, to continue to use Tier 1. Tier 1 is constantly growing, and if they can use Tier 1, we very much encourage it. But if your data is so large that it cannot be on Tier 1, then we definitely encourage you to reach out to ESS-DIVE to inquire more about Tier 2. So if you think your data is large enough to require special handling, come talk to us. Summary. Or is my data suitable for large data support? I feel like we've talked a lot about other people's data, and hopefully I've kind of gotten a little bit across to let you figure out if your data is right for large data. But hopefully we can clear that up a little bit in this next section. So to summarize, Globus is used for data contributors trying to upload large data. Tier 2 is meant to support data users trying to access that large data. Common types of large data, as I mentioned, model data, remote sensing, genomics, sensor networks, or maybe yours. But what about yours? The real key is to talk to us. Help us learn more about your data, and we can help make the determination of where or which data storage and which data transfer methodology is best for you and your team. So how do we kind of begin this conversation? Reach out to us at ESS-DIVE support@lbl.gov. And we have some kind of questions that we will ask you. And if you want to start the conversation with the answers to these questions, it'll get that conversation rolling much more quickly. So kind of some of the questions we will want to know is, what's the total volume of your data set? How many files are in that data set? What's the max and min, kind of the range of the file sizes? Is your data structure hierarchical? Could it be flattened? Do you think what is lost, or maybe what is gained in organizing your data in a way that is a little bit less nested? Where is your data currently being stored? Is it on a local desktop? Is it on your project server? Is it in the cloud or on Google Drive? That kind of information is really important for us to understand. What is your available local storage and processing? If you're using a Chromebook, you might have a little bit of a harder time with a lot of stuff. And finally, is your local internet connection actually strong enough to prevent timeouts and support a full upload or download process? So these are the kinds of questions that our team is going to want to discuss with you, so we can figure out the best way to support you with your data, whether that's transferring it into Tier 1 or into Tier 2, whether that's using the package service. Maybe the best solution is using the package service API, or maybe it's using Globus. But reaching out to the ESS-DIVE support team is, you have to in order to get the Globus collection. But the first step is always to reach out to the ESS-DIVE support team and engage with us in a conversation about the best steps forward. Large data support documentation. We have large data support documentation coming very soon to the ESS-DIVE documentation website, which is, you can find the link here at the bottom, docs.ess-dive.lbl.gov. The large data support documentation will kind of cover contacting ESS-DIVE about large data support, including those questions that were just on a previous slide. how to use Globus for data transfers, navigating tier 1 and tier 2 data, kind of what we're doing on the internal side as far as managing and preserving data on tier 2, and finally how to download data from tier 2 and from Globus. So all of that will be in our soon to be released large data support documentation on our Git books, which is again at docs.ess-dive.lbl.gov. And now I'm going to open up to questions. The slide says any questions, but I can see the Q&A is going strong. So maybe we can start with those if there are questions that people still feel need to be answered. I'm seeing a lot of the conversations have been going here. Does anyone want to pipe up?
Yeah, Shreyas, I was wondering if you wanted to, take away some of the questions that you're answering.
Sure, yeah, I have been answering them on the chat, but I'll also just maybe repeat some of those because I think some of these things are worth discussing. So I guess the first question was whether tier 1 will have hierarchical structure capabilities, and the yes, there are some features in tier 1 coming in the next year that will support some level of hierarchical data. It probably won't be for very large data sets, but for smaller data sets, there will be some features. The exact what that feature will look like exactly is still under development. So but yes, there will be some hierarchical features for data tier 1 in the coming year. For Charu, do you want to answer the DOE funded question, or maybe that's answered well enough in there? I guess for
I don't think I need to. This is a standard question we get asked, and it's in our FAQ. I can put the link.
Okay. Got it. And then for Globus, I think I wasn't sure. And there was a little bit of just because Zoom doesn't let me delete comments, I kind of posted ones that might not be fully clear. But the question is, does Globus automatically assume that data will go into tier 2? To which the answer is no. I mean, Globus is basically just giving you a staging area when you're uploading it through there. And so that will basically be a way for you to give us your data quickly using a high performance transfer interface. And then internally, we would use our tools and APIs to either push it to tier 2 or we would push it to tier 1, depending on what your request looks like. On the flip side, if you're using Globus to download the data, that will be tier 2 data. So the download interface, Globus is just sitting on top of our tier 2 data. Robin had a question about versioning. So tier 2 itself doesn't inherently do versioning, but we do have some support for, we'll just have the latest version on tier 2. And then, you'll basically work with our support staff to figure out whether something needs an update on tier 1 and whether, metadata needs to be updated there. And Fiona and Madison, you might be able to answer that question a little bit better.
I think you got most of what I would probably say.
Okay. And then there was a question around Google Earth Engine and cloud processing tools. I mean, in some sense, what tier 2 is giving you is an HTTP endpoint that will let you just directly access files. Whether or not that's suitable for integration with Google Earth Engine is probably a deeper, longer question. I mean, tier 2 isn't giving you necessarily like streaming data, but if you can, format it and make it available, it should in theory be possible. But I think that's probably a longer question we'll have to explore directly.
I can add a little bit. We have one data set, one of the remote sensing ones that were shown as an example where some of the data were processed on Google Earth Engine. And for that, we have a different feature that we didn't talk about here. It's part of the same external link, but instead of pointing to a tier 2 endpoint, we would just point to the Google Earth Engine endpoint. So you can make your your processing scripts and your data public on Google Earth Engine. And then we could basically have an external link that points to that. So one of the remote sensing data sets actually does that, where they did, yeah, pretty much the raw data. It's actually a 4 terabyte data set, and then some processed version of that 256 gigabyte data file, that example that you saw, that's stored on ESS-DIVE. All the data processing was done on Google Earth Engine. So there were a bunch of data sets, and one of them had a link to a Google Earth Engine link. So we can sort of connect data sets that way, but it doesn't automatically harvest, allow you to harvest data and move it between the two, if that was what your question was. But we can certainly point to data on Google Earth Engine. And I just want to interpret this question. Tier 2 is just a storage. We don't allow like data processing and upscaling on tier 2 directly. It's just literally a place to store and distribute data. We are in the process of like setting up a separate server where you can do like some data processing. And Shreyas, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, but that's something we'll eventually have, at the end of this year, right? But it's not really, tier 2 is not, you're not going to be like directly interfacing with data on tier 2 there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we are slowly introducing some compute capabilities for doing additional work, though. I suspect that that's going to be more, you'll be able to run some Jupyter notebooks and do some data processing against data on ESS-DIVE data. But that may not be something that you would have. I think if you want a capability to sort of do that in real time from cloud tools, that's probably a separate question. I think this is more about just enabling some compute for you to do some analysis on the data. There was a question that I got directly in chat, so I'll answer that. So the question was, does 500 gigabyte, do you support smaller sizes than 500 gigabytes? And the answer is yes. I think that's sort of a guideline, but I think if there's largish data that kind of fits the other needs, that's fine. And just, so our support team will guide you towards what the appropriate location for the data would be. Each file on tier 2 does have a unique HTTPS endpoint for direct download. So any individual file in tier 2 can be directly pulled with a unique HTTPS location. So that is inherent in tier 2. And then the third question is, there a unique DOI generated for the uploaded data? The DOI is generated for the data package that sits in tier 1 in the tier 1 metadata, and then that gets linked out to the tier 2 backend. So the DOI is generated, but it's at the dataset level for the corresponding landing page in tier 1. And I don't know, Fiona, if you have a web page, an example page that you can point people at to show people what it looks like in tier 1. Because tier 2 should be visible, the files should be visible. It's just Globus that's not available right now. So I don't know if you can share your screen.
Yeah, let me pull that up. Let me find that data set, find the example I was using earlier.
While you're doing that, Fiona, I just want to give a little bit of context to one of the questions here about versioning, and whether or not you're going to get a new DOI if you update your data files in tier 2. So with versioning, you as a user get to choose when you want to update your DOI. So here, Fiona is going to show you what the DOI is. That's all associated with this metadata here on this landing page. You get to choose when you want to get a new DOI as a user. And we don't, even on tier 1, if you update your files, we will just publish the new files. And then if you want to make it a new data set because you think the files have changed substantially, and you think that you still want the old version because you've cited it in papers or whatever reason why that old data set needs to exist, then you create a new data set if you want the new version. But by default, we're not going to issue you a new DOI for either tier 1 or tier 2 file changes or metadata changes. That's a request you need to make to us if you want to change it, but then if you want to change the DOI, you would basically be starting a new data package. So this old data package would you could figure out if you want to retire it or whether you just want to leave it there for like people to access.
So really quick, jumping back to what Shreyas was saying. Here is an example of a data set with data on tier 2. You can see here in the external links. We have their original landing page as well as this link out to tier 2. Well, I haven't tried clicking this today since. Huh. So we can still see this is all accessible, and then we go to the Globus.
So Globus is down. That's the piece that you won't be able
Oh,
to
that's
use.
the piece that's down. Okay.
Correct. So tier 2 is you can get to the web system. It's the nurse Globus that's going through an upgrade right now, so we're kind of holding off on that.
Okay, thank you. I was being overly cautious by filming everything then. But so yeah, you can see here, this is what it looks like to kind of jump through from a dataset landing page into the tier 2 data.
And can you just point out how the DOIs are the same for this? Because it's one data set.
Absolutely. So we see here that this is, you can see here 190, 63, 48. Here we have the DOI is slightly reformatted rather than having the colon and the slashes. This is the same DOI. So they are kind of linked via the DOI in name so that we can very quickly and easily connect this data set, which is identified by its DOI, to this data in tier 2 via the DOI. And we use DOIs over everything else just because they're persistent. So.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a question to clarify a little bit about the versioning? So I see that you have DOIs and you also have another identifier after that for the version. If I were to say update the metadata, I assume I would get a new version number. So if somebody wanted to cite an old version of the data, would they be able to access that old version on tier 2, or will tier 2 always be just the newest version?
Tier 2 will always be the current version, assuming it's the same DOI.
Okay, so if the data changes at all, and I want people to be able to access like an older version of the data, I would have to make a new data package with a new DOI?
I think
That is
correct.
Yeah. So just so you know, tier 1 also only surfaces the latest version of the data by default. We do store prior versions of the data, all the changes, any change you make on tier 1, we do have records of it, but it's not automatically surfaced to users. So even if people have a version number, but the DOI has been superseded by a later version because you've either updated the metadata or you've updated your data files, they will only see the latest version, regardless on tier 1 or tier 2. The only difference for the 2 is that tier 1, we keep all the different copies of all the changes that have happened. And with tier 2, that's kind of not practical just because we're in large data realms. And so you don't want to keep every version of large data. It just will create a lot of large data replicates that most people don't necessarily want to retain. So if you are making substantial changes to tier 2 and then you want to retain the old version, then I would recommend creating a new data set for that purpose.
So
okay, that makes sense.
We could support, I think there's nothing technical preventing us from storing the older version is another way to put it. So if you feel like there's a version that you have cited and used and you want to sort of have that be frozen, and then you want to update the data, we would recommend that you just make a new data package and then you would have both those versions.
Got it. Thank you.
And then there was one question about what happens to ESS-DIVE data after the funding has expired. I just want to make it clear that, you're in data archive. So we don't, delete data packages and remove data packages. They're there. And, unless the data contributor makes a request to retire the data set and not have it searchable for whatever reason, they're just available. And if you're ESS funding, any ESS funded project, is allowed to store data, whether it's currently funded or historically funded. So there's, even if your funding expires, but 2 years down the lane, you finish writing your papers and you have data, you can come back and store data on ESS-DIVE. It doesn't impact your ability to archive data on ESS-DIVE, as long as it was funded through the ESS program at some point in time.
If there are any other questions, go ahead or definitely speak up. I just want to also take a moment to highlight how to connect with us offline if you come up with a question in the middle of the night tomorrow or tonight. Oh, I really need to know this. You can reach out to us at ESS-DIVE-support@lbl.gov. But are there any other questions?
I'll also just mention that we do have a really great opportunity coming up. Every fall, we have an annual community data workshop for ESS-DIVE where we invite everyone who is using ESS-DIVE or who will in the future, anyone who's part of the ESS community or and part of your projects are invited to attend this workshop where we'll have presentations on our new features and where we're going in the future and some discussions around like key topics and features that we're developing. And we'll also have hands-on tutorials and just a lot of information about everything that we offer, including not only our features, but also like reporting formats and yeah, so if you're interested in getting notified about this workshop and also future webinars, you can join our mailing list. And I put a link to that in the chat as well. And I'll stop recording now.